The officers around him believed it was a bluff. The Germans, who had broken through the American lines, laughed at the idea that anyone could reverse that disaster. Amid the cruelest winter of the war, with temperatures that froze engines and souls, a single man decided to challenge the impossible. His name was George Patton, and his response to defeat was simple: attack now. The German attack had created a deep gash in the heart of the Allied forces. It was as if the map had torn apart in the middle of Western Europe. On one side, 250,000 enemy soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks, advanced through ice-covered forests toward Belgium. On the other, exhausted American units, out of fuel, surrounded and without communication. The press would call that collapse a bulge, but for those inside it, there was no name, just survival. While the generals debated how to react, Patton was already planning the counterattack. The extreme cold paralyzed armies, but not that man's mind. He saw in the crisis a rare opportunity to turn the enemy's blow into his own hunting ground. What was despair for others was opportunity for him. This is the story of how the American Third Army, under his leadership, moved like a living machine through the snow, converted disadvantage into strength, and transformed Hitler's last great effort into his final defeat. Over the next few minutes, you'll discover how one commander managed to spin an entire army amid the chaos under conditions that would make any advance impossible. How he united frozen, demoralized, and surrounded men around a single order: attack now or never again. But what he did next, and the two words that triggered that turnaround, would change forever the way modern war understands the impossible.
December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, the calm of the Ardennes was shattered. Under a curtain of fog and snow, 29 German divisions broke through the American lines. It was the counteroffensive no one expected. 3 armies, 250,000 men, and 1,000 tanks advancing in absolute silence. Allied radios were silent. Aerial observers were blinded by the clouds. In a few hours, the Western Front had buckled under the force of a surgical strike. The objective was simple and devastating: split the Allied armies in two, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a peace on German terms. The surprise was total. American defenses in that sector were weak, made up of resting troops and inexperienced recruits. The frozen roads turned into traps. Entire columns were isolated, and the enemy seemed to emerge from all sides. In the confusion, maps lost their meaning, communications collapsed. The enemy advanced too fast to be contained. In less than 48 hours, the center of the Allied forces seemed on the verge of collapse. In Allied headquarters, the shock was immediate. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, called an emergency meeting in Verdun. The map on the table showed an open wound that expanded every hour. Bastogne, a small dot in the middle of the storm, had become the pivot of the war. If it fell, the enemy army would have a clear path to the coast. If it held, it could delay the German advance and buy time for a miracle. It was a race against the clock, and on that frozen chessboard, everyone looked to the same name: George Patton. He commanded the Third Army, positioned to the south, but his forces were facing the opposite direction. Turning an entire army under enemy fire seemed unfeasible. No one believed it was possible to move entire divisions before the Germans reached their objectives. Every hour the news grew worse. Towns fell, roads closed, fuel and ammunition reserves dried dry. It was the kind of situation that destroyed careers and empires. But it was precisely in this scenario that Patton saw what others did not: a chance. While everyone else tried to react, he was already preparing the counterattack. And when he was finally called to Verdun to discuss the catastrophe, Patton brought no excuses. He brought a plan.
George Smith Patton Jr. was not just a general. He was a force of nature in uniform. Son of a military lineage, he grew up believing that the battlefield was the stage where destiny decided who deserved to be remembered. From a young age, he studied Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, and learned something no manual taught: war is a theater of quick decisions, not perfection. At 59, he had already crossed hell twice, in the First War and then in the sands of Sicily and North Africa. But by the end of 1944, he was still seeking the chance to prove, definitively, that he was more than an executor. He was a strategist on the level of history. His fame preceded him. Soldiers admired him, enemies feared him, and colleagues considered him reckless. Patton spoke like he shot, without warning. His faith in attack as the universal solution made him unpredictable, and that audacity had taken him both to glory and to the brink of ruin. The episode in which he slapped two exhausted soldiers nearly destroyed his career. He was sidelined, humiliated, and ignored during the Normandy invasion. But while others saw punishment, he saw training. He swore that the next time the world needed a fearless man, he would be ready. And he was. When the Third Army was placed under his command, it transformed into a machine of movement. He visited the front lines in an open jeep under enemy fire, as if death itself were an administrative detail. Every soldier who saw him understood. If the old man was there, no one had the right to retreat. His presence was not symbolic, it was fuel. Behind the explosive temper, there was method. Patton was obsessed with planning and discipline. He studied maps as if they were living organisms. He knew every road, every hill, every bridge, and believed that speed was an army's deadliest weapon. War is simple. Find the enemy, attack him before he thinks, and keep moving. That philosophy guided him more than any military doctrine. But now, facing the German offensive, his entire legacy was at risk. One mistake would seal his ruin. And when Eisenhower called him to Verdun, the man many judged reckless was about to prove that madness and genius sometimes wear the same uniform.
The attack began before dawn. The dense gray sky hid the roar of approaching German engines. When the first grenades fell on American positions, the entire line collapsed in minutes. Through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, columns of tanks traversed narrow roads, pushing aside what remained of enemy defenses. Communications failed, orders were lost, and panic spread as fast as the cold. The enemy advanced like a tide of steel. It was the kind of offensive that crushed morale and maps at the same time. In American headquarters, the shock was absolute. What seemed like a localized attack revealed itself as a continental-scale operation. Hitler had bet everything on the final blow, cutting the Allies in two, isolating British forces, and seizing Antwerp before winter ended. To do this, he had used the last fuel, the last reserves, and every tank that could still move. It was a desperate gamble, and it was working. As American units fragmented, a small Belgian town called Bastogne became the epicenter of resistance. The enemy surrounded it in a few days. Inside, poorly equipped soldiers fought without supplies, frozen, waiting for reinforcements that seemed not to come. For many, Bastogne would be remembered as the symbol of imminent defeat. It was at this point that destiny turned toward George Patton. Called to Verdun, he heard from Eisenhower and the other generals that the picture was grim. The front was broken, forces trapped, and no counteroffensive seemed viable. General Bradley estimated that any reinforcement movement would take weeks, the time the Germans needed to win. But Patton, while observing the map covered in red marks, was already thinking differently. He had noticed something no one had mentioned. The German advance was fast, but fragile. It depended on captured fuel and narrow roads. All it took was breaking the rhythm, and the enemy machine would seize up. And then, amid the chaos and voices of despair, he stood up and said the unthinkable. "I can turn my army in 3 days and attack north." The room fell silent. Some smiled, others doubted, but Patton didn't wait for approval. He knew that to win, he needed to start before the enemy understood what was coming. And so the impossible plan began to take shape.
amid the snow, fear, and disbelief of everyone.
The conference room in Verdun was filled with incredulity. While generals discussed routes and deadlines, Patton stepped forward with the same confidence of someone who already knew the story's end. He announced that his army, 6 entire divisions, could turn north in less than 72 hours. The silence was almost hostile. No one believed it. Moving 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, tanks, and supply convoys over ice-covered roads in the midst of combat sounded like delirium. But Patton didn't make promises, he executed. The secret was simple, but frightening. He had already prepared. While others saw the German advance as unlikely, his staff had been studying a possible northward turn for days. 3 plans were ready, coded and reviewed. All he needed was one order. When Eisenhower asked how long it would take to react, Patton replied without hesitation, "We're already moving." And he was. The code was transmitted with 2 words, "Play ball." In seconds, the gears of the Third Army began to turn. Engineers, artillerymen, infantry, logistics convoys, all changed direction as if the impossible had been rehearsed. It was clockwork on a continental scale. The distance separating Patton from the front was nearly 160 kilometers, covered in ice, fog, and narrow roads. The enemy believed no one would dare try. That was exactly why Patton would do it. The plan was bold: attack not where the enemy was strongest, but where he was most vulnerable, the base of the German advance. Instead of defending, he would choose to strike. Bastogne would become the pivot of the maneuver, the point where the siege would be broken and morale restored. Each division received clear orders, each route traced with almost surgical precision. But Patton knew that paper and maps don't win wars. What came next would be a race against the cold, time, and doubt. Soldiers would march without rest, mechanics would work without light, and every kilometer covered would be paid with exhaustion. He had promised to turn the game around. Now he had to do it under the worst imaginable conditions. And as the orders echoed over the radio, the snow began to fall harder. The army moved. The clock had started ticking. The Third Army began to move like a living creature made of steel and will. For 3 days and 3 nights, columns of trucks, tanks, and artillery advanced over roads that barely existed. The snow fell without cease. The wind cut soldiers' faces like blades. The cold was so intense that engines froze and rifles jammed. But no one stopped. Every kilometer was conquered with physical effort and faith in a leader who refused to admit the word impossible. Patton's orders were direct: keep moving, sleep after victory. The convoys followed narrow valleys, crossing wooden bridges that creaked under the weight of Sherman tanks. Mechanics had to start engines every half hour to keep the oil from hardening. Men without gloves worked until their fingers bled. Many walked with feet wrapped in rags, as boots couldn't withstand the ice. It was the cruelest winter in generations, and it was in this that the general staked his reputation. While other commanders watched from afar, Patton was there. He crossed the lines in his open jeep, covered only by a heavy coat and the conviction that presence inspires more than words. Exhausted soldiers raised their eyes and saw their general passing, immune to the cold, as if the weather itself feared him. That was enough to make them continue. The vanguard units cleared a path toward Bastogne, the heart of the siege. The enemy believed the winter would protect them, but Patton turned the weather into a weapon. The ice prevented the Germans from moving their columns quickly, while the Americans, driven by urgency, progressed even when tires locked and wheels skidded. Every crossroads captured was held at the cost of lives, but no man retreated. Radios began transmitting a phrase repeated among battalions: "The old man's coming." That alone reignited hope. For those fighting surrounded in Bastogne, that promise was all that remained.
The column advanced, mile after mile, under a white curtain that hid both danger and glory. And when the first echo of American engines reached the ears of the besieged, they understood the improbable was on its way.
While the snow devoured the horizon and communications failed, Patton maintained an almost absurd routine for a general amid the chaos. He visited advanced positions every day, stopping at crossroads, talking to soldiers, repeating simple orders with a confidence that became contagious. His presence was the antidote to despair. He believed morale was as essential as fuel. Men don't fight for manuals, they fight for leaders, he said, and he made sure to be visible, even if it meant defying bullets, cold, and logic itself. Faith was also part of his strategy. When the weather prevented Allied planes from taking off, Patton called his chaplain and demanded a prayer, not as consolation, but as a weapon. The text that spread through the army asked for clear skies and strength to fight. It was more than religion. It was a collective order of hope. When the prayer was distributed, the effect was immediate. Every soldier began to believe the sky itself would soon be on their side. But the man behind the helmet was more complex than the myth. Patton was not blind to pain. He carried on his back the weight of decisions that cost lives. He slept little, ate less, and wrote to his wife with almost painful frankness. He said God had spared him so many times only for that moment, the day he would need to turn the course of a war. That belief moved him as much as strategy. He was a commander who used reason to win, but faith to endure. Soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts. Blood and Guts. The nickname, which sounded like a joke, had become literal. He demanded nothing from anyone that he wouldn't do himself. When passing roads covered in bodies and wreckage, he told his men, "Remember, every step is one less toward the end of this war." It was his brutal way of turning suffering into purpose. Those on the brink of exhaustion fought again. Patton's leadership was not measured in orders, but in movement. He didn't just say, "Attack." He showed the way. And when the clouds began to part, many believed the sky itself had heard the prayer. On the morning of December 23rd, the miracle happened. The wind shifted, and the sky, once blind and heavy, opened as if the atmosphere itself had received direct orders. For the first time in days, Allied planes could take off. Fighters and bombers emerged from the clouds like hungry predators, diving on German columns that had believed themselves protected by the storm. The roar of engines overhead was the sound of the turnaround. Soldiers on the ground, covered in snow and mud, raised their eyes and saw that Patton's prayer had been answered. As the sky blazed, the Third Army advanced. Sherman tanks traversed improvised roads, breaking the ice with the weight of their treads. American artillery unleashed continuous thunder on enemy positions, and infantry followed the sound, step by step, without stopping. Every hill captured was a blow to German morale. Bastogne, surrounded and exhausted, heard the distant echo of battles and knew rescue was approaching. The enemy tried to react. Tiger and Panther tanks emerged from the forests, firing at short range. The ground shook. Explosions lit the night like lightning trapped on the earth. But the tide had turned. The Germans, once predators, became prey. Their tanks lacked fuel, their supply lines were broken, and their soldiers fought more against the cold than the enemy. On December 26th, Patton's column reached the gates of Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion broke the siege and found the survivors of the 101st Airborne Division. The reunion was silent, without speeches or applause, just the sound of engines that hadn't stopped since Verdun. The siege was broken. The impossible had been done in record time. But for Patton, that was just the beginning. He sought not just to save a town, but to annihilate the enemy's momentum. What Hitler had believed to be his last great offensive had become a logistical disaster.
The American general, with his exhausted army, had turned winter into a weapon and faith into combat strength. The Germans, who had mocked the cornered Americans, now retreated before an adversary who refused to freeze. The impossible was no longer legend. In the weeks following the liberation of Bastogne, the Ardennes landscape transformed into a white cemetery. What remained of German forces retreated in disorder, burning fuel and hope at the same time. Patton kept the pace, ordering successive attacks until the enemy advance disintegrated completely. What had begun as a blitzkrieg offensive by the Reich ended as a collapse. Across the Western Front, the German army bled its last energy. The Bulge on the map, the symbol of the invasion, was now an empty space. The number said what words didn't need to repeat. Over 100,000 German casualties, 700 tanks destroyed, 1,600 aircraft shot down. The enemy's strategic reserves had vanished in less than a month. On the American side, losses were heavy, but the outcome would change the course of the war. Patton's Third Army had executed a maneuver that, until then, existed only in military theory, moving an entire army in combat and winning. Eisenhower, who had watched the turnaround in real time, called the operation an unparalleled feat. Churchill, in a speech, declared the Battle of the Bulge the most remarkable American victory of the war. Field reports recorded something even more valuable. Allied morale was restored. After Bastogne, no one doubted the United States' ability to fight and win under any conditions. For Patton, however, public recognition was just the surface. In letters to his wife, he confessed feeling he had fulfilled the role for which he was born. "Destiny called me in haste when all seemed lost," he wrote. He knew victory was due not just to strategy, but to the blind belief that movement is life. And it was that movement, human, technical, spiritual, that sealed the fate of the Third Reich on the Western Front. The winter of 1944-45 would mark the end of German initiative and the beginning of the definitive advance toward Berlin. What Hitler planned as national redemption became the prelude to his total defeat. And at the center of that turnaround was a man who dared believe that speed could replace fear. The enemy had lost time, space, and control. And Patton had proven that leadership and audacity, when combined, can rewrite even the laws of war. They laughed. They called the Americans amateurs, comfort soldiers who would freeze before fighting. But when January arrived, the snow in the Ardennes was no longer white. It was marked by tank tracks and German blood. That winter, the cruelest of the war, had revealed something the enemy did not understand. Victory is not won with weapons alone, but with will. Patton had turned despair into doctrine, defeat into strategy, and doubt into faith. He didn't wait for the weather to change. He made the weather change. What began as a disaster became the greatest American land triumph of World War II. Bastogne held, the German offensive died frozen, and the Third Army entered history as the army that moved faster than logic allowed. Winston Churchill, in his dry and precise tone, summed it all up. It was the greatest battle ever fought by the United States. But for Patton, there was no glory. There was only duty. The same man who ordered attack walked among wreckage, thanking his soldiers and murmuring that God had been generous. The lesson he left goes beyond the battlefield. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting before fear takes shape. And that is what changed the course of the war. When the Germans realized it, the enemy they had underestimated now dominated the field, the sky, and the winter. Victory did not come from a stroke of luck, but from the combination of discipline, belief, and decision. Bastogne was not just a military rescue, it was a moral turnaround. The sound of boots in the snow ceased, but the echo of that attack still resonates in every story told about courage and command. George Patton died shortly after the war's end, but his voice, firm, relentless, and convinced, remains. He proved that the impossible is just the name given to what has not yet been attempted. And if you want to keep hearing real stories like this, battles that defied logic, leaders who changed destiny, and decisions that cost everything, subscribe to the channel now. Here, every day, a new chapter of history comes to life, narrated with the same force and intensity that shaped the world. Tomorrow, another episode awaits, and the next battle has already begun.